"Do not follow the lights," Evelyn Carter said. "Follow the horse." At 2:17 in the morning, 5 soldiers stood knee-deep in rainwater inside a narrow Arizona canyon, staring at the only person no one had expected to lead them anywhere. The storm had swallowed the moon hours ago. Their GPS units were dead. The radio gave them nothing but static, and the trail behind them had disappeared beneath a wall of mud and loose stone. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed, the man who had dismissed Evelyn before sunset, now sat slumped across the saddle of a gray Mustang named Rook, his injured knee secured with a field brace and his face pale from cold. The others waited for an order, but Mason could no longer give one. So they looked at Evelyn. She was 31, white, slight enough that the men had joked about the weight of her pack, with rain-darkened brown hair tied low against her neck. Water ran from the brim of her hat. Her boots were soaked. Her hands trembled from the cold, though her voice did not. Ahead, a faint red light blinked beyond the canyon bend, steady and inviting. Private Nolan Briggs pointed toward it. "That has to be the rescue team." Evelyn did not answer. She watched Rook instead. The Mustang stood perfectly still, every muscle tight beneath his wet coat. His ears turned toward the darkness on their right, then flattened when the red light flashed again. Evelyn loosened the reins. Rook took one careful step backward. Somewhere beyond the bend, water moved through stone with a low sound that did not belong to the rain. "Carter," Briggs said, louder now, "the light is our best chance." Evelyn crouched and pressed 2 fingers against the flooded ground. The vibration was faint, almost nothing, but it came in a rhythm. 3 seconds. Pause. 3 seconds again. Not thunder. Not machinery. Water building behind a narrow passage. She rose and looked at the ridge above them. "That light is fixed," she said. "Rescue lights sweep. That one doesn't." Specialist Tyler Boone wiped rain from his eyes. "Then what is it?" "An old blasting station," Evelyn replied. "The road beneath it ends at a wash." Mason stirred weakly on the saddle. Even half-conscious, he recognized the meaning. A dry wash in this storm was not a road. It was a funnel. Behind them, Rook lifted his head and released a sharp breath. Evelyn turned. The Mustang was no longer watching the red light. He was facing a narrow shelf climbing along the canyon wall, barely wide enough for one person at a time. It looked steeper, darker, and far less certain. Briggs stared at it. "You want us to take the horse up there?" Evelyn placed one hand against Rook's neck. Beneath her palm, his heartbeat was fast but steady. "No," she said. "He wants us to take him." Then the sound behind the bend grew deeper, and every man in the canyon finally understood that whatever was coming would reach the red light first. 10 hours earlier, the afternoon sun had turned the training yard at Fort red, mesa the color of old copper, when Evelyn Carter arrived with a canvas pack over one shoulder and a folded paper map tucked beneath her arm. The recon candidates were already gathered beside the corrals, checking saddles, radios, and route markers for the overnight evaluation. Most of them wore the relaxed confidence of people who believed the hardest part of the exercise would be proving they were better than the person standing next to them. Evelyn wore no expression at all. She signed a roster, placed her pack beside the equipment table, and walked toward the gray Mustang waiting alone at the far end of the fence. Rook had thrown 2 experienced riders that morning and refused to let a third fasten the rear strap beneath his saddle. Now, he stood with his head high, watching every movement in the yard. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed noticed where Evelyn was going and gave a quiet laugh. "That horse does not like strangers, Carter." Evelyn stopped 3 feet from Rook and lowered her gaze, giving him space to decide what came next. "Neither do most good scouts," she said. A few soldiers smiled, but Mason did not. He studied her slight frame, the plain brown braid at the back of her neck, and the careful way she kept her hands visible. "This evaluation covers 18 miles of rough country," he said. "Steep grades, loose rock, and no support vehicles after dark. This is not a trail ride." Evelyn nodded once. "Understood." Mason stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound private, while still making sure the others could hear. "Recon teams depend on speed, endurance, and people who can carry their share without becoming someone else's problem. I have seen this program lower standards before. I will not allow it tonight. The yard grew quieter. Evelyn looked at him, then at the route board behind his shoulder. You will not have to, she said. Mason waited for more, perhaps an argument or a complaint, but she turned away. Rook's ears moved toward her as she approached again. She did not reach for his reins. She placed her pack on the ground, removed one glove, and held her hand near his muzzle without touching him. The Mustang breathed against her palm. A second later, he lowered his head. The soldiers near the fence stopped talking. Evelyn ran her fingers along the edge of the saddle blanket, checked the cinch, then crouched beside his left front leg. A small stone was lodged near the outer edge of the hoof, nearly hidden beneath dried mud. She removed it, examined the wear on the shoe, and stood. Mason folded his arms. We have handlers for that. Then one of them missed it, Evelyn replied. She crossed to the supply table and added a paper compass, a second length of rope, and 2 sealed water pouches to her pack. Private Nolan Briggs watched her and shook his head. Planning to get lost? Evelyn looked toward the western ridge, where a thin line of clouds had begun to gather above the heat. Planning not to. Rook shifted closer until his shoulder nearly touched hers, and for the first time that afternoon, Mason stopped looking at Evelyn as though she did not belong there. He looked at the horse instead, as if Rook had noticed something the rest of them had not. 30 minutes before departure, Evelyn walked the edge of the corral while the others reviewed the planned route. The air above Fort Red Mesa was still hot, but the wind had begun moving in uneven breaths, first from the southwest, then from the north. She stopped beside a wooden post and watched a line of red ants carrying their eggs upward through a crack in the fence. Beyond, the corrals, small birds lifted from the cottonwoods near the dry creek and flew toward higher ground. No one else seemed to notice. Mason stood at the route board with a marker in his hand. Checkpoint 1 is 4 miles north. From there, we follow Coyote Wash through the canyon and reach the observation ridge before sunset. We return by the same route after the night exercise. Evelyn looked at the blue line drawn through the lowest part of the terrain. When was that route last inspected? Mason glanced at her. 3 days ago. Before the rain west of the ridge? There was no rain here. There does not have to be rain here. Briggs gave a tired smile. The sky is clear, Carter. Evelyn looked toward the thin clouds gathering over the distant mountains. They had grown darker in less than 20 minutes. For now, she said. Mason placed the marker down. This is an evaluation, not a weather seminar. Stay with the formation and follow instructions. Evelyn nodded, but she folded her paper map differently from the others, leaving the upper ridgelines visible instead of the marked trail. She checked the elevation notes, then used a pencil to draw a second route along the western shelf. Tyler Boone noticed and leaned closer. That is not on the assignment. It is an old livestock path. It ends near Broken Arch. The printed map says it does. Boone frowned. And you think the map is wrong? Evelyn tucked the pencil behind her ear. I think maps remember the day they were made. At the water trough, Rook lowered his muzzle but did not drink. He smelled the surface, stepped back, and turned his head toward the canyon. Evelyn dipped 2 fingers into the water. A faint layer of dust trembled across it, even though the trough stood sheltered from the wind. She looked toward the ground beneath Rook. His weight had shifted onto his rear legs. Easy, she whispered. The Mustang remained tense. Mason approached with his own horse and watched her loosen Rook's reins. Problem. He hears something. He is a horse. Yes. Mason waited, expecting an explanation. Evelyn placed her palm against the wooden trough. There was again a soft vibration traveling through. The post from somewhere beyond the western ridge. Too steady for thunder. Too distant for vehicles. Water moving through rock, perhaps miles away, but moving fast. She turned toward Mason. Coyote Wash may not be dry tonight. His expression hardened. We are not changing the route because a horse will not drink. Evelyn met his eyes without raising her voice, then marked the western shelf as an emergency exit. Mason stared at her for a moment, then drew a small line on his map, more to end the conversation than accept the warning. Evelyn said nothing. She led Rook away from the trough and checked the rope on her saddle once more. Above the base, the birds continued flying uphill. The team left Fort Red Mesa at 4:30 in the afternoon. 6 riders moving north beneath a sky that still looked harmless from the ground. Mason placed Evelyn at the rear of the formation with Rook and 2 overloaded equipment cases strapped across the Mustang saddle. It was not where a scout was usually tested. It was where extra weight was placed when no one wanted it slowing the front. "Your job is simple," Mason said. "Keep the gear balanced, stay on the trail, and do not interfere with route decisions." Evelyn checked the knots once, then again. "Understood." Briggs rode past her and glanced at the cases. "Looks like you got promoted to pack handler." Boone laughed quietly. Evelyn did not. She shortened one strap by half an inch, shifted the heavier case toward Rook's center, and rested her palm against his shoulder until he settled. The first 4 miles were easy. The trail crossed open desert scattered with mesquite and pale stone, then climbed toward a broken line of red cliffs. Mason kept the pace fast enough to test endurance, but slow enough to preserve daylight. Every 20 minutes, he asked the lead rider for distance and direction. He never asked Evelyn. She counted turns anyway. She watched how long the sun remained visible between the ridges. She noted where rainwater had cut new channels across the old trail. At one crossing, Rook stopped before a patch of cracked earth. The others continued for several yards before Mason noticed the gap behind them. "Carter, move." Evelyn dismounted and pressed the heel of her boot against the ground. The crust gave slightly, revealing darker soil beneath. This section was underwater recently. Mason turned his horse. The inspection team cleared it. They cleared the surface. She pointed to a shallow line running beneath the trail. The wash shifted. "There may be a hollow below us." Mason looked at the dry earth, then at the lowering sun. "We are not losing time to test every patch of dirt." He directed the team around the spot only because Rook refused to step forward. 10 minutes later, Boone's horse sank ankle-deep near the edge of the same wash. No one was hurt, but the formation slowed while the rider backed carefully on a firmer ground. Briggs stopped smiling. Mason said nothing. Near checkpoint 1, the marked trail bent east toward Coyote, Washington. Evelyn unfolded her paper map and compared the printed line to the canyon ahead. A wooden route marker stood beside the trail, its arrow pointing east, but the post leaned at an angle and the soil around it had been disturbed. She dismounted again. On the back of the marker, beneath a layer of dust, someone had carved a small triangle above 2 parallel lines. An old field symbol. High ground unsafe. Low route temporary. Evelyn stared at it longer than she intended. "What is it?" Boone asked. This marker was moved. Mason rode back, already impatient. "By whom?" "I do not know." She looked west toward the narrow shelf she had marked earlier. "But the arrow is wrong." Mason studied the canyon entrance. It was wide, dry, and easier than the climb to the west. The official route goes east. The official map may be older than that flood channel. We follow the assignment. Evelyn folded the map and returned it to her jacket. Mason turned to the others. "Carter remains at the rear. No route changes without my order." They entered Coyote Wash as the sun dropped behind the cliffs. Rook followed, but his ears stayed fixed on the darkening sky behind them. By the time the team reached the narrowest section of Coyote Wash, the last sunlight had disappeared from the canyon floor. The cliffs rose on both sides like dark walls, blocking the wind but trapping every sound. Hoofs struck stone. Metal buckles clicked against saddles. Somewhere far above them, thunder rolled once, then again, closer than before. Mason raised one hand and slowed the formation. Night equipment. The riders dismounted and switched on their helmet lamps. 6 white beams moved across the red rock, revealing fresh lines of moisture where the canyon had been dry an hour earlier. Evelyn removed the heavier equipment case from Rook and checked the sky through the narrow opening overhead. The clouds were moving east faster now. "We should turn back," she said. Mason secured his radio to his vest. "The return route is behind us." "Not for long." A burst of static cut through his reply. Mason pressed the transmit button. "Red Mesa Control. This is Recon 2. Radio check." Nothing answered except a thin electronic hiss. Boone tried his unit. Briggs tried his. Each radio returned the same empty sound. Evelyn looked toward the ridge above the canyon. A small relay beacon blinked once against the clouds. Lightning flashed behind it. For half a second, the entire canyon turned white. Then the beacon went dark. The thunder arrived almost immediately, shaking dust from the cliff walls. Rain followed in heavy drops that struck the stone hard enough to sound like gravel. Mason looked up. "Move." We reached the upper checkpoint and call from there. The team mounted again, but the trail had already begun changing beneath them. Water gathered in shallow channels, carrying sand across the path. Rook shortened his steps. Evelyn kept one hand low on the reins and watched the runoff lines grow wider. Ahead, Boone's horse startled when a loose rock rolled from the slope. The animal stepped sideways, and Boone lost his balance. He slid from the saddle onto a lower shelf several feet below the trail. "I'm all right," he called, but the ledge beneath him was narrow and wet. Mason dismounted before anyone else moved. He secured a rope around his waist and handed the other end to Briggs. "Hold steady." Evelyn was already beside him. "The slope is unstable." Then we moved quickly. Mason descended 2 careful steps, reached Boone, and guided him toward the rope. A crack sounded from above. Evelyn looked up and saw a thin line opening through the mud. "Mason now." Boone grabbed the rope. Briggs pulled. Mason pushed him upward just as part of the slope shifted beneath his boot. His right leg twisted, and he dropped to one knee. He did not cry out, but his face tightened. Evelyn reached him before the others understood what had happened. She braced his leg, checked the joint through his soaked uniform, and looked into his eyes. "Can you stand?" Mason tried once. His knee folded under him. Behind them, a deeper sound moved through the canyon. Not thunder this time. Stone, mud, water. Evelyn turned toward the trail they had entered less than an hour earlier. In the darkness, a section of the canyon wall gave way and spread across the path, sealing the route back to Fort Red Mesa. Mason followed her gaze. Rain ran from his helmet as the truth settled over the team. They had no radio, no clear trail, and no leader who could walk without help. Evelyn rose slowly and looked at Rook. The Mustang was facing uphill. Mason forced himself upright with one hand against the canyon wall, keeping most of his weight off his injured leg. Rain struck his helmet and ran down the side of his face. He looked toward the southern branch of the wash, where the ground sloped gently downhill. "We take the lower channel," he said. "It reconnects with the service trail 2 miles east." Evelyn turned her light toward the channel. Water only covered the tops of their boots there, and the route appeared wider than the steep shelf above them. It looked safer. That was what made it dangerous. "That is not a trail," she said. "It is the main drainage." Mason tightened the strap around his knee. "The map marks it as an emergency route." The map was printed before the last 2 flood seasons. Briggs looked from Mason to Evelyn. "We cannot stay here." "We are not staying," Mason said. "We are moving east." Evelyn watched a line of foam gather around stone, then disappear as the current pulled it deeper into the channel. The water was rising slowly, but the sound coming from beyond the bend was growing faster. "The storm is west of us," she said. "Every wash between here and the ridge will empty through that channel." Mason's expression hardened. Pain had made his face pale, but his voice remained firm. "Carter, you are not in command." "No," she replied. "But the water does not care who is." For one quiet second, only the rain answered. Then Mason pointed east. "Move out." Boone took the first horse forward. Briggs followed. Evelyn led Rook behind them, but the Mustang stopped at the mouth of the lower channel. She gave him more rein. He stepped sideways instead of forward. His ears flattened. The muscles along his neck tightened beneath her hand. "Come on," Briggs called. "We are losing time." Evelyn did not pull. She lowered her light and saw small pebbles trembling across the wet ground. A thin branch floated past them, moving faster than the water around their boots. Then another appeared, larger, freshly broken. "Everybody back," she said. Mason turned. "Keep moving." Evelyn raised her voice for the first time. "Back. Now." Something in her tone stopped them. Boone guided his horse around. Briggs stepped toward the higher wall. Evelyn took Rook by the cheek strap and led him onto a narrow rise of stone. Mason remained where he was, staring down the channel as though refusing to retreat might prove the map correct. Evelyn crossed the distance, put his arm over her shoulder, and moved him uphill before he could argue. The sound reached them a moment later. It began as a low vibration beneath their boots. Then the darkness beyond the bend changed shape. Water swept through the lower channel, carrying mud, branches, and loose brush along the route Mason had chosen. It filled the space where they had been standing less than 30 seconds earlier and continued east without slowing. No one spoke. Boone turned off his helmet light because his hand had begun to shake. Briggs stared at Evelyn. Mason watched the flooded channel until it became impossible to see the trail beneath it. Finally, he looked at Rook. The Mustang stood beside Evelyn, breathing hard but steady, his attention fixed on the higher shelf. Mason lowered his eyes. "What do you see up there?" he asked. Evelyn studied the slope, the runoff, and the dark line where stone met brush. "A chance," she said. "But we leave the horses, the extra equipment, and anything we cannot carry." Mason looked at his injured knee, then at the steep climb. Before he could speak, Evelyn began unfastening the cases from Rook's saddle. One by one, the others moved to help her. The team worked in silence, stripping every saddle down to what could still keep them alive. Evelyn opened the first equipment case and removed only the medical kit, 2 emergency blankets, a coil of rope, and the sealed water pouches. The rest stayed behind. Extra batteries, training markers, spare tools, and the heavy observation equipment were placed beneath an overhang above the rising channel. Briggs hesitated over a metal case containing the exercise records. "Command will want this back." Evelyn tightened the rope around the medical bag. "Command will want us back." He set the case down. Boone helped the 2 remaining soldiers, Caleb Warren and Luke Mercer, secure their packs closer to their bodies. Rain had soaked through every uniform, and the cold was beginning to slow their fingers. Evelyn watched each man work. Boone favored his left shoulder after the fall. Warren was breathing too quickly. Mercer had stopped speaking altogether. Mason tried to stand without support and nearly lost his balance. Evelyn caught his arm before he hit the wall. "I can walk," he said. "Not far enough. Rook cannot climb that shelf, carrying me." Evelyn looked at the Mustang, then at the slope. "He can if we reduce the load and let him choose his footing." Mason started to object, but the words faded when he saw the others waiting for Evelyn rather than him. It was not a formal transfer of command. No one announced it. No rank changed hands. The decision simply moved toward the person who was still seeing clearly. Evelyn removed Rook's remaining packs and replaced them with a folded blanket across the saddle. She checked every strap, then guided Mason closer. "Put your weight on my shoulder." "Carter." That was not a request. Briggs looked down, hiding the beginning of a smile, but no one laughed. Together, Evelyn and Boone helped Mason onto Rook. The Mustang shifted once beneath the unfamiliar weight, then settled when Evelyn placed a hand against his neck. She turned to the team. "From this point forward, no one moves alone. Boone stays behind me. Warren stays in the middle. Mercer watches the rear. Briggs keeps one hand on Mason whenever the trail narrows." Briggs nodded. "What about you?" "I watch all of you." She tied a short length of rope between each man's pack, leaving enough space to move, but not enough for anyone to disappear in the dark. Mason looked down at the line. "That will slow us." Evelyn tested the first knot. "So we're searching for someone who slips away." The water below struck the canyon walls with a steady roar. The higher shelf was barely visible beneath wet brush and loose stone. Evelyn stepped onto it first, placing each boot carefully before shifting her weight. Rook followed without being pulled. Boone came next, then Warren, Briggs, Mason, and Mercer. After 20 yards, Warren's breathing became uneven. Evelyn stopped the entire line. 4 breaths in. 4 out. Warren shook his head. "I am fine." "Then prove it slowly." She waited until his breathing matched hers. Only then did they continue. The shelf climbed sharply, forcing them close to the canyon wall. Rook tested every step before committing his weight. Mason kept one hand on the saddle horn and the other against the rock. For the first time since leaving the base, he did not give an order. At the first narrow turn, he looked down at Evelyn walking beside Rook in the rain. "Where are you taking us?" he asked. She studied the slope above, where a line of darker stone curved toward the west. To the part of the map no one uses anymore. The shelf narrowed as it climbed west, forcing the team to move beneath a ceiling of stone that kept some of the rain from reaching them. Water still found its way through cracks overhead, falling in cold, steady drops. Evelyn kept one hand on Rook's reins and the other against the canyon wall, feeling for changes in the rock before placing each step. The printed map showed nothing beyond broken arch except a blank section marked unstable terrain, but she remembered older lines. Beneath the newer ink, routes drawn by people who had trusted elevation more than roads. After another quarter-mile, the shelf ended at a wall covered in wet brush. Briggs lifted his light and shook his head. "There is nowhere to go." Evelyn handed Rook's reins to Boone and moved closer. Behind a brush, a narrow opening ran between two slabs of sandstone, almost invisible from the trail. She cleared away several branches and revealed a weathered cut in the rock. A five-pointed star rested above a single vertical line. Boone leaned forward. "Is that a survey mark?" "No," Evelyn said. Mason looked down from the saddle. "Then what is it?" She did not answer immediately. Her thumb moved across the inside of her left wrist, where a thin leather band had been hidden beneath her glove. She pulled the glove back just far enough to reveal a small metal plate stamped with the same star. The mark was worn smooth at the edges, as though it had been carried for years. Briggs saw it before she covered it again. "Where did you get that?" Evelyn stepped through the opening. "From someone who knew this route." The passage beyond was steep but protected from the worst of the storm. Old wooden pegs had been driven into the rock at shoulder height, and shallow steps had been cut into the stone where rain could not erase them. Mercer ran his light across the wall. "Who built this?" "Pathfinders," Evelyn said. The word changed Mason's expression. Fort Red Mesa had not used Pathfinder teams in more than a decade. Their work belonged to older recovery operations, when aircraft could not enter narrow terrain and satellites could not see beneath heavy weather. Mason studied the back of Evelyn's jacket as she checked the first step. "How do you know their markings?" "The same way you know the sound of your own unit on the radio." It was not an explanation, but no one pressed her. Evelyn returned to Rook and shortened the lead line. The Mustang lowered his head and entered the passage without hesitation. Mason's injured leg brushed close to the rock, so Evelyn walked beside him, guiding the saddle around each narrow turn. 50 yards higher, they reached a small hollow beneath an overhang. The ground was dry enough to rest. Evelyn checked Boone's shoulder, replaced the wrap around Mason's knee, and divided one water pouch among the 5 men. She drank last. Briggs watched her fold the empty pouch into a precise square and place it in her pocket. "You have done this before," he said. Evelyn looked toward the darkness above them, where another faded star marked the continuation of the route. "Not here," she replied. A pause followed, but somewhere close enough. Then Rook lifted his head toward the upper passage, and from beyond the next ridge came a faint red light. The red light flashed again beyond the upper passage, faint through the rain, but steady enough to pull every eye toward it. Briggs stood first. "That has to be the search team." Mercer looked toward the glow, as if warmth might already be waiting there. Maybe they reached the ridge road. Even Boone seemed relieved. Mason shifted carefully in the saddle and studied the light. "How far?" Evelyn did not answer. She stepped from beneath the overhang and watched 3 complete flashes. Each appeared at the same height, in the same place, with exactly the same pause between them. No sweep, no movement, no second light answering from another position. Rook left the shelter behind her, then stopped before the trail divided. The right branch climbed toward the red signal. The left branch disappeared into a darker cut along the ridge. Briggs pointed right. "That is our direction." Evelyn crouched near the stone and brushed wet sand away from a rusted metal plate set into the ground. Most of the lettering had vanished, but one word remained beneath the corrosion. "Blasting." She looked again at the red light. It is not a rescue beacon. The relief on Mercer's face faded. Then what is it? An obstruction light on an old mining station. Mason frowned. There are no active mines in this sector. It does not have to be active for the warning system to keep running. Briggs looked up the right trail. A station means shelter. Maybe a radio. Evelyn picked up a loose stone and tossed it several feet ahead. It landed with a hollow sound. Rook immediately backed away. She raised her light and found narrow cracks running across the trail, filled with fresh rainwater. The station sits above a cut in the ridge. The ground beneath that trail has been excavated. Boone examined the cracks. Could hold us. Maybe one person. Maybe all of us. Maybe none. Briggs stared at the red light, unwilling to release the first hope they had seen in hours. The left path could lead nowhere. It leads upward, Evelyn said. That is enough for now. Mason studied both routes. Until that moment, every decision he had made had sounded like an order. This time, his voice was quieter. Carter, what do you recommend? The others turned toward her. Evelyn looked at Rook. The Mustang's ears were fixed on the left passage, where cold air moved down from higher ground. Water on the right trail flowed toward the hidden excavation. Water on the left ran away from it. We climb west, she said. There should be a marker above the ridge and a maintenance route on the other side. Mason glanced at the metal star beneath her glove. You are certain? Evelyn shook her head. No, the honesty unsettled Briggs more than confidence would have. She continued before anyone could speak. But the red light gives us shelter for minutes. High ground gives us distance from the flood. I choose distance. Mason looked at the right trail one last time. Then he folded his map, placed it inside his jacket, and nodded toward the left passage. Carter leads. No one challenged him. Evelyn adjusted the rope between them and moved into the darker route. Behind her, the red light continued flashing with patient certainty, offering safety where there was none. They had climbed less than 50 yards when a deep crack rolled across the ridge. The right trail dropped several inches, taking the first section of stone with it. Briggs stopped and stared back. Evelyn did not. She kept one hand on Rook and led them higher. The western passage climbed in tight turns until the canyon opened onto a narrow shoulder of rock above the flood. Wind struck them immediately, cold and strong enough to push rain sideways across the ridge. Evelyn lowered her head and kept Rook close to the inside wall. The Mustang moved carefully, placing each hoof with more patience than speed. Mason remained in the saddle, one hand gripping the horn while Briggs steadied him from the left. Below them, Coyote Wash had become a dark ribbon of moving water. The red warning light still flashed across the gap, but part of the trail beneath it had vanished. No one looked toward it for long. Evelyn found another faded star carved into a stone post near the top of the shoulder. Beneath the symbol, a shallow line pointed north. The route ahead appeared simple. A flat shelf crossed 30 yards of open rock before reaching a stand of juniper trees on higher ground. Boone exhaled with relief. That is the first easy section we have seen. Evelyn stepped forward, but Rook did not follow. The lead rope tightened in her hand. She turned and gave him more space. The Mustang lowered his head, smelled the wet stone, then backed away. Briggs looked over his shoulder. Is he done? No, Evelyn said. She ran her hand along Rook's neck. His skin trembled beneath the wet coat. His ears moved toward the flat shelf, then turned back toward the ridge behind them. Mason watched closely. What does he hear? Evelyn did not answer. She crouched and placed her palm against the stone. At first, she felt only cold rainwater running beneath her fingers. Then a faint vibration traveled through the ground. It stopped, returned, stopped again. Not the steady movement of floodwater below. Something beneath the shelf was shifting under pressure. She picked up a small rock and rolled it across the flat surface. Halfway to the junipers, it disappeared into a thin crack hidden by darkness and rain. Nobody steps onto that shelf, she said. Boone aimed his light toward the crack. It ran several feet in both directions. It looked solid. Evelyn stood. Solid ground does not move under a horse before it moves under people. Mercer pointed toward the trees. That is the only way across. Evelyn scanned the wall above them. 10 feet higher, a narrow ledge followed the ridge in the same direction. It was rougher, steeper, and partly blocked by brush, but the stone had broken naturally from the main wall instead of resting over. Empty space. We go above it. Mason looked at the climb. Can Rook make that with me on him? Evelyn studied the angle, then loosened the saddle straps and removed the last water pouch. Not with all the weight. Mason understood before she finished. Then I walk. You cannot. I came for 30 yards. Not on that ledge. He looked at her, waiting for another option. Evelyn handed Rook's reins to Boone and moved beside the saddle. Briggs and I will support you. Rook climbs without a rider. We meet him at the junipers. Mason glanced at the dark ledge, then nodded. No argument. No order. Trust had replaced both. They lowered him carefully and formed a 3-person brace, Evelyn on his injured side and Briggs on the other. Boone led Rook toward the upper path. The Mustang tested the first rise, found his footing, and climbed. Halfway across, a low grinding sound moved through the ridge. Everyone stopped. The flat shelf below them dropped several inches, then broke away in sections, sliding into the canyon with a roar that disappeared beneath the storm. Mercer stared at the empty space where they had nearly walked. Evelyn tightened Mason's arm across her shoulders. Keep moving, she said. This time, every person obeyed before the echo faded. By the time they reached the junipers, Mason could no longer hide the strain in his face. Evelyn helped him back onto Rook and checked the support around his knee before the team moved again. The rain had weakened, but the cold wind still crossed the ridge in hard, uneven gusts. Ahead, the old Pathfinder route descended toward a stone basin where a rusted communications post leaned beside the trail. Most of the antenna had broken away, yet the metal housing was still sealed. Evelyn knelt beside it and cleared mud from the access panel. Briggs looked at the corroded box. That thing has not worked in years. Not by itself, she said. She removed the field radio from Mason's pack, opened the battery compartment, and examined the damaged contact. Then she took a metal clip from Rook's saddle strap, straightened it against the edge of a stone, and connected the radio to the old relay post. Static filled the basin. Weak at first, then sharper. Boone stared at the device. What frequency are you using? Evelyn turned the dial past the channels assigned for the training exercise. An older recovery band. Mason watched her enter a sequence without checking a note. You memorized it? She did not look up. Some numbers are difficult to forget. The radio clicked. A faint carrier tone answered from somewhere beyond the ridge. Evelyn pressed the transmit button. Her voice remained calm. Each word measured so the weak signal would carry. North Star 7. 5 walking. 1 carried. Moving toward Marker Ash. Requesting controlled recovery at Southern Rise. Silence followed. Briggs looked at her. North Star 7. Before she could answer, the radio came alive with a burst of static and a distant voice. Unknown station, repeat call sign. Evelyn closed her eyes for half a second. North Star 7. At Fort Red Mesa, Captain Daniel Hayes stood inside the operations room while technicians searched for Recon 2 through dead channels and failing weather systems. The moment the call sign reached the speakers, he stopped speaking. Every officer in the room turned toward him. Play that again, he said. The transmission repeated through the static. Hayes walked to a secure terminal, entered his clearance code, and opened an archive that had not been accessed in 9 years. A file appeared with a faded photograph of Evelyn Carter in a weathered field uniform. Beneath it were 4 words. Lead Pathfinder. Restricted Recovery Unit. A younger officer leaned toward the screen. Sir, that program was closed. Hayes kept his eyes on the photograph. The program was closed. The people were not erased. He opened an old terrain overlay. Marker Ash appeared on the southern rise, less than 3 miles from the base, but the surrounding canyons were marked unsafe for vehicles and aircraft in severe weather. A search team had already requested permission to enter. Hayes denied it. They will wait at the southern rise. Sir, Recon 2 is still inside the storm zone. Hayes looked at Evelyn's last known position. No, they are with the only person in this county who can bring them out. Back on the ridge. The radio clicked again. North Star 7, recovery point confirmed. Southern Rise will remain clear. You have the route. Mason heard every word. So did the others. Evelyn disconnected the clip, returned it to Rook's saddle, and stood. Briggs stared at her as if seeing a different person. Who exactly are you? Evelyn lifted the reins and looked toward the dark trail ahead. Right now, I am the one who knows the way home. Mason lowered his head, and no one asked another question. The old Pathfinder route curved south beneath the ridge, descending through wet stone and scattered juniper toward Marker Ash. The storm had moved farther east, leaving behind a cold wind and the steady sound of water draining through the canyons below. Evelyn walked beside Rook with one hand on the reins and the other near Mason's boot, ready whenever the Mustang stepped across uneven ground. Boone followed close behind. Warren's breathing had steadied. Mercer had begun speaking again, quietly counting each person whenever the trail turned. Briggs carried the damaged radio against his chest as though it were something valuable. No one complained about the pace. After another half-mile, Mason leaned forward in the saddle. "Carter." Evelyn looked up. "Yes, Sergeant." His voice was lower than before. "I was wrong." She returned her attention to the trail. "Keep your weight centered. The ground drops on your right." "I'm not talking about the trail." Rook stepped over a narrow channel of runoff. Evelyn waited until everyone crossed before answering. "I know." Mason looked at the 5 people moving behind her. Hours earlier, he had believed authority meant being the first to speak and the last to doubt himself. Now every decision that had kept them alive had come from the person he had placed at the rear. "You warned me about the wash," he said. "You warned me about the marker. I heard you, and I still chose not to listen." Evelyn adjusted the lead rope as the path narrowed. "You listened after the water came. That was too late. Not for us." Mason was quiet for several steps. "Why did you not tell me who you were?" She stopped beneath a bent juniper and checked the ground ahead. The Pathfinder star had been carved into the trunk years ago, nearly hidden beneath new bark. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" Mason did not answer. That was answer enough. Evelyn continued. "You did not need my file. You did not need a call sign. You only needed to judge what I did instead of what you expected me to fail at." The words were not sharp. That made them harder to avoid. Mason lowered his eyes toward the saddle horn. "I thought I was protecting the team." "So did I." He looked at her again. "From me? From a bad decision." Ahead, the clouds began to separate. A pale line appeared over the southern rise. It was not sunrise yet, but the darkness had started to thin. Then Boone stopped and pointed. Far beyond the trees, 3 white lights stood in a straight line across the ridge. This time they moved slowly from side to side. Searchlights. Real ones. Mercer released a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Warren covered his face with both hands for a moment. Briggs raised the radio, but Evelyn lowered it gently. "They already know where we are." Mason watched the lights grow brighter as the team continued down the slope. "What happened to North Star 7? He asked. Evelyn kept her eyes forward. "We completed the last recovery." And after that, the wind moved through the junipers, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and fuel from the vehicles waiting beyond the rise. After that, there was no team left to lead. Mason understood why the call sign had sounded less like a title and more like a memory. He did not ask again. When the trail opened, Fort Red Mesa appeared in the distance, its perimeter lights glowing beneath the clearing sky. Briggs whispered, "Home." Evelyn looked back and counted them once more. 5 walking. 1 carried. All present. Only then did she allow herself to believe it. The first recovery vehicle met them at the southern rise just before dawn. Its headlights washed across the wet trail, the tired horses, and the 6 figures moving out of the last line of junipers. Captain Daniel Hayes stood beside the open gate with 2 medics and a row of soldiers behind him. No one cheered. The silence felt more respectful. The noise. Boone reached the gate first, then Warren, Mercer, and Briggs. Each man stepped aside instead of continuing forward. They waited for Evelyn. She led Rook across the final stretch with Mason still in the saddle, one hand resting against the Mustang's neck. When they stopped beneath the lights, Hayes looked at Mason, counted the others, then turned to Evelyn. For a moment, He seemed to see not the soaked candidate standing before him, but someone from a much older photograph. North Star 7, he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. Evelyn Carter is enough. Hayes accepted the correction with a small nod. The medics moved toward Mason, but he raised one hand. Wait. With Boone and Briggs supporting him, he lowered himself from the saddle and stood on his uninjured leg. His face tightened with the effort, yet he refused the stretcher until he had turned toward the assembled team. The same soldiers who had laughed in the training yard now stood covered in mud, cold, exhausted, and alive. Mason looked at each of them before facing Evelyn. I placed Carter at the rear because I believe she would slow us down, he said. His voice carried across the gate without needing to rise. Tonight, she saw what I missed, stopped us when I was wrong, and brought every member of this team home. No one moved. Mason straightened as much as his injured knee allowed. Pathfinder Carter. Evelyn held his gaze. She did not smile. She did not ask for an apology. Get that knee examined, Sergeant. A faint breath of laughter passed through the group, not mocking this time, but relieved. As the medics helped Mason away, Hayes stepped closer. There's a place for you here, he said. Evelyn looked past him toward the base, where the eastern sky had begun to turn pale gold. There was always a place, she replied. The question was whether anyone was willing to see it. Then she turned to Rook. While the others were wrapped in blankets and given warm drinks, Evelyn removed the Mustang saddle, checked every strap mark, and lifted each hoof one at a time. A shallow scrape crossed the edge of the left front shoe. She cleaned it carefully, speaking to him in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Briggs approached with a blanket over his shoulders. You should let someone take care of you. Evelyn continued, checking Rook's leg. I am. Mason watched from the medical vehicle as she finished with the horse before looking at her own soaked boots. He understood then that her strength had never been about proving she belonged ahead of anyone else. She had counted them at every turn, carried their fear without naming it, and chosen the path that kept the slowest person inside the group. When Rook was settled, Evelyn finally walked toward the lights of Fort Red Mesa. The soldiers near the gate stepped aside for her without being told. She did not raise her voice. She did not claim the moment. She simply passed between them as the sun reached the ridge, and every person there stood a little straighter. Respect had not arrived with her file, her call sign, or her past. It had followed her out of the darkness, one life at a time.